In this problem, we're asked to consider the operations of the Rembrandt Hotel, Restaurant, and Casino Complex. We're given information regarding the revenues and the direct costs of both the hotel, the restaurant, and the casino, and we can total them up to get the entire complex revenues and direct cost. We're also told that the hotel, casino, restaurant complex has $14.5 million in fixed overhead, common overhead, that will need to be allocated to each one of these divisions or segments. And we're going to, in this problem, consider three different alternative allocation bases. We're going to consider allocating that common fixed overhead cost on the basis of direct costs, square footage, and number of employees. And we're given the information regarding square footage, number of employees, and again, the direct costs. Let's begin by calculating our segment margins for the hotel, restaurant, and casinos, and our segment margin percentages. So our segment margin, recall, is simply our revenues of $16.4 million divided by our direct costs, direct traceable costs of $9.8 million. So our hotels have a segment margin, again 16 minus the 9, of $6.6 million. Our segment margin then is this $6 million divided by the $16 million in revenues. And we can compare that with the segment margin and segment margin percentages for the restaurant and the casino. And in terms of segment margins, the casino seems like it has the highest segment margin, but in terms of true profitability, we would need to consider how much of this common allocate or common fixed cost should be allocated to the casino. And let's go ahead and, for the total Rembrandt, our segment margin 16 million minus our 16 million minus our fixed cost gives us a total income before taxes for the Rembrandt of 1.6 million and a total margin before taxes 1.6 divided by 34 of 4.86%. All right, our next step is to decide how are we going to allocate this $14 million in common fixed overhead. And again, we'll consider first direct costs, an allocation based on square footage, and an allocation based on number of employees. The hotel is incurring $9.8 million of the total $17 million in direct costs, or it is incurring 55% of the total direct cost. The restaurant is incurring 21% of direct costs, the casino 23%, and again we want to make sure that this row sums to 100%. In terms of square footage, the hotel occupies 80,000 of the 160,000 total square feet, or 50% of the total space. The restaurant occupies 10%, the casino 40%, and again we want to make sure the total adds to 100%. In terms of employees, the hotel employs 200 of the 500 employees, or 40% of the employees. The restaurant employs 10% and the casino 50%. And again, we're going to consider different allocation bases, and we can see in terms of direct costs, if we allocate on the basis direct costs, the hotel will be assigned the largest proportion of the direct costs, whereas if we allocate on the number of employees, the casino will be assigned the largest portion of this $14 million in direct cost. Let's go ahead and begin our allocation based on direct cost. Once again, we have our segment margin that we calculated earlier, and we want to subtract from that our allocated fixed overhead costs. And again, we're going to allocate 55% of the $14.5 million to the hotel for a total of $8 million. That gives us a pre-tax segment income of $6 million minus $8 million, a loss of $1.4 million, or a segment margin on a percentage basis, the $1.4 million divided by 16 of negative 8.6%. So we're losing money on our hotels, it appears, based on our allocation of fixed overhead on using direct costs as our allocation base. Let's go ahead and see how we look for the restaurant and the casino. The restaurant will be allocated $3 million of our fixed costs. It appears also to be operating a loss, while our casino will only be allocated $3.4 million, and it has a positive segment margin based on this choice of allocation. Let's go ahead and now allocate our $14.5 million in fixed common overhead on the basis of floor space. So for our hotel occupies 50% of our square footage. So 50% of the square footage or floor space times the 14.5 million means that we will assign to our hotel $7 million in fixed overhead costs. Notice our allocation of overhead has gone down from $8 million to $7 million, so not surprisingly, our calculated pre-tax segment margin has increased. Instead of a $1.4 million loss, we have a $600,000 loss, and our segment margin is the 6 divided by the 16, a loss of 4.7%. Our allocation of overhead to the restaurants went from $3 million to $1.4 million, and so again its profitability has increased. In fact, now it appears as though the restaurant is operating at a positive pre-tax segment margin. And since we've allocated more of our overhead costs to the hotels, we've gone from 3.5 million, sorry, to the casino, 3.5 million to 5.8. Not surprisingly, our segment margin has gone down from 37% to 18%. Let's go ahead and consider the final allocation base, which was based on number of employees. And we can see number of employees, our allocation will drop to 40% for the hotel and increase to 50% for the casino. So our hotel will appear more profitable and our casino less profitable still. So let's go ahead and make that allocation. So our allocated overhead based on number of employees, we'll take our 40% times our 14.5 million in overhead. From that, we will subtract that amount from our segment margin, and now suddenly our hotel, based on allocating overhead on the basis of number of employees, actually appears to be profitable. Our restaurant remains at that same 99% or 0.99%, and our casino's profitability has dropped to 6.61%. We want to look sort of at a summary of our pre-tax segment margins after we've allocated fixed overheads. We can see they vary dramatically based on our choice of allocation basis. What's important to remember is in terms of making decisions, particularly in the short run, our fixed costs remain constant. In other words, nothing's going to happen to that allocated 14.5 million in the short run. And if we were to discontinue any one of these segments, their segment margin would go away, and right now it's contributing a considerable amount to covering our common fixed overhead cost. So our perceived profitability really has to do with our choice of allocation base. In the long run, we really want to try to figure out what is a cause and effect. Which one of these segments or divisions is receiving a benefit from that common fixed overhead, and assign the overhead cost accordingly. But even if we had a very accurate allocation of our overhead, and let's say that it was based on floor space, well, the hotel would appear to be operating a loss, but our risk would be if we shut down the hotel, we might be able to cut back some of our fixed overheads, but one thing's for certain, we probably wouldn't have the same revenue stream for our restaurants and casinos, because people come, stay in the hotel, go to the restaurant and casinos. And without the hotel, we would harm our revenue streams and our segment margins for both of those types of businesses. So it's difficult to make decisions when we're allocating our common fixed overhead costs. One thing we can say for certain in terms of performance evaluation, we're probably best evaluating our managers on the basis of segment margins rather than our after-tax, after allocation segment margins, because our choice of allocation base is somewhat arbitrary, and we're going to get a lot of pushback on the basis of these managers. So let's use our segment margins before we allocate overhead to evaluate our managers. We wouldn't want to say the casino is doing a better job than the hotel. What we would want to do is create metrics where we would look at the segment margin from the hotel on a year-to-year basis and expect our manager to improve the segment margin percentage.